Can everybody hear me, please? If you don't mind, please take a seat. If you don't mind, everybody please take a seat. Did you hear me? Hello. If everybody please take a seat, if you don't mind. If everybody please take a seat. Thank you all very, very much. If you don't mind, please take a seat and go ahead and begin to eat. That's what they told me to say anyway. I'm here to welcome you. Real fast, I'll just take this very short and say thank you all for coming. My name is Terry Hartwick. I know I'm on the wrong side of the river, but she couldn't get anybody else, I don't think, right? I'm supposed to give a welcome here, so let me go ahead and rephrase. Not too long ago, some of you may have heard this, so, hey, man, how you doing, Virgil? So I was introduced to a community center. At that community center, I came in about like this, and they said kids. So the kids were about 6 years old to maybe 11, and there was about 40 of them sitting around the table and on the bleachers there, and they go, kids, do y'all know who this is? So all of a sudden they look up at me and they go, that's Joe Biden, that's Joe Biden, that's Joe Biden. So no, I'm not Joe Biden, but I am Terry Hartwick. To welcome all of y'all here for dinner. Please start eating and let's have a good time. Thank you all for coming. My pleasure for being here. Thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. It is really my honor to have all of you here for this really important conversation. I am Carrie Campbell. I'm the South Outreach Director for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And really, you all, seriously, please begin eating. Everybody's waiting. I don't want y'all to go hungry. So before we get today's program started, I want to say a couple of very important thank yous. One, to our Arkansas founding partner, Walmart, and our South Initiative chair, Coca-Cola, without whom we couldn't do these events like this across the country. In addition, I want to thank our local partners, the Arkansas State Chamber of Commerce, the Associated Industries of Arkansas, Winrock International, Arkansas Inc., and Global Ties Arkansas. And importantly, I'd like to thank our Arkansas Advisory Committee members, some of whom are here with us today, led by former Senator Tim Hutchinson and former Senator Mark Pryor. This powerhouse of Arkansans really helped champion our work and move our work forward in this state. And finally, I'd like to thank our featured speakers, Representative French Hill, Sarah Thorne, and Eddie Acevedo. I think I got it right, Acevedo. And so with this group of really bright people, I know that our conversation today is going to be really dynamic and impressive. So I know many of you in the room here today are familiar with U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, USGLC for short, since everything in D.C. is an acronym. But for those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit more about who we are and what we do. So at USGLC, we've built a diverse network of leaders in all 50 states that share a common interest of supporting America's global leadership in the world, including over 500 American businesses, humanitarian organizations, military veterans, faith-based leaders, and foreign policy luminaries, all who have come together to support the importance of our civilian tools of national power, development, and diplomacy. Our coalition represents a rich spectrum of backgrounds and experiences, from USGLC's year-long leadership training, our Next Gen program, to our Farmers for Prosperity initiative. Our network spans from coast to coast throughout the country. That's from Maine to Arizona, Washington to Ohio, to right here in Arkansas, and everywhere in between. Our bipartisan National Advisory Council is made up of our nation's smartest national security and foreign policy minds, former secretaries of state, national security advisors, and former members of Congress. And we are particularly proud of our growing voice among the military community. Those who understand better than most the critical role that international development and diplomacy play as part of our national security strategy. This includes our National Security Advisory Council, co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Anthony Zinni, and it's comprised of over 250 retired generals and flag officers. They work alongside our Veterans for Smart Power. This is our initiative comprised of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are all committed to strengthening America's civilian tools of national security. And what brings us all together is that shared belief in America's global leadership. We believe that strategic investments in development and diplomacy are essential to protecting our national security, advancing our economic interest, and really projecting the very best of American values. That's why we talk about this tiny 1% of the federal budget. It's called the International Affairs Budget, IAB, and it's one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments that we can make as a nation. And it's why we ask our communities all around the country, global leadership, what's it worth? And so now I want to turn to you all. We want to hear from you all. On the table, there are note cards with little pencils. So when you think of America's global leadership, what do you think of? Why does it matter to the community right here in Arkansas? We ask you to write those down. Just leave them on the table. We'll pick them up after the event, and we'll share that with other individuals around the country just like this. So I'll share with you what we've heard in the past. We've heard around the country that America's global leadership is about diplomacy. It's funding American diplomats and embassies around the world and supporting our key allies, including working with NATO to stand up for freedom as Ukraine fights against Russia's unprovoked war. We've heard that America's global leadership is about feeding the world and tackling the growing global food crisis and preventing malnutrition in children and other vulnerable communities. We've heard that America's global leadership is about global economic security and that it is vital as it supports 1 in 5 jobs in the U.S. maintained by international trade. And American businesses rely on those markets to strengthen our economy right here at home. Now, I know when you turn on the television and all of the headlines are coming at you, it can be really hard to see through and see the incredible successes and return on investment for this 1% of the federal budget. But let me share a couple of successes with you that you might not have heard. Since 1990, the number of people living in extreme poverty around the world, and that is defined as $1.25 a day, extreme poverty since 1990 has been cut in half. That's over 1 billion, with a B, fewer people living in extreme poverty. It is in jeopardy as conflict continues and disasters continue around the globe, but it shows that we can make progress. For every $1 the United States spends in preventing conflict, that saves us $16 in the cost of responding to conflicts. And today, 11 of our top 15 trading partners were once recipients of America's foreign assistance, including many of the trading partners right here in Arkansas. So now, the fastest growing economies are in low and middle income countries, and American businesses are taking notice of this, including those in Arkansas. You'll hear from Sarah soon. That these are investment opportunities that help the local economies across the country. And in Arkansas, $5 billion of goods are exported to foreign markets each year. So you can see how vital it is right here at home. So that's why it's important that you all are here today, and we appreciate you taking your time to join us. After today's discussion, we hope that you will join our efforts in making progress while we address the headlines of the day. So thank you for being a part of our journey to build a better, safer, and more prosperous world, one that we all want to live in. And now I'd like to introduce Clint O'Neill, the Executive Director of Arkansas Inc., and Rush Deacon, former CEO of Arkansas Capital Corporation and board member of Global Ties Arkansas, to tell us why America's global leadership matters to them and introduce today's featured speakers.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clint O'Neill, Executive Director of the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. I have never been called Joe Biden, but it is an honor to serve on the U.S. Global Leadership Arkansas Advisory Committee with many of you. It's an honor to be here with many of the AEDC council members, members of the legislature, with Secretary McDonald, with our newly appointed Economic Developer of the Year, Jack Thomas. But at 8, oh, thank you. I saw him out in Hall, said I'd give him a shout out. But at AEDC, we focus on job creation and creating a healthy economy in the areas of entrepreneurship and small business, helping existing companies grow and recruiting new ones. A big part of that is international outreach. The offices that we have, the AEDC office in Europe, in Asia, getting ready to formally announce a new office in Korea. But this year alone, Governor Sanders and Secretary McDonald and I have traveled to South Korea, to Japan, to England, to Germany. More trips coming up, but these international relationships are so important to us. Just last week, a company headquartered in Ireland made an announcement of 148 new jobs in Pocahontas, Arkansas, a great project. And those come about because of these friendships and relationships and intentionality that we have internationally. Whether it's trade, tourism, sister city relationships, or a number of educational, economic, or cultural ways of building bridges, we need these strategic investments in diplomacy and development to help fight corruption, promote the rule of law, to be open to new markets for goods and services, which is a key to our economic prosperity here at home. It's good for the world, it's good for American business, for national security, and it's good for Arkansas. And now I'll turn it over to someone who knows that very well, Rush Deacon, board member of Arkansas Global Ties and former CEO of Arkansas Capital Corporation.
Thank you, Clint, and thank you, Carrie. I have the distinguished title of former CEO. When you get to my stage of your professional career, there are a lot of formers in your professional bio. But one thing I'm not a former member of is the board of directors of Global Ties Arkansas. I've enjoyed the Global Ties Association for many decades now. Global Ties is part of the Global Ties U.S. network, which partners with U.S. State Department and others, hosting international visitors from all over the world, often being young leaders that are chosen by the U.S. embassies and consulates around the world, and many of whom have gone on to be heads of state of their country. The very personal connections made possible by Global Ties drive your quintessential citizen diplomacy initiatives. That is, advancing global peace and prosperity, as we love to say, one handshake at a time. Tony Carr, Executive Director of Global Ties Arkansas, is here. Thank you for your leadership, Tony, and all that you do. Here in Arkansas, we are privileged to be represented by Congressman French Hill, a friend of mine for many years, who not only understands the concept of diplomacy at the personal level, but he is a true champion for it. Before I bring Congressman Hill up here to say a few remarks, I want to first introduce the two distinguished guests who will be joining him after his remarks for an engaging panel discussion moderated by Carrie. Joining that discussion, Sarah Thorne is the Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Walmart. She is USGLC's Arkansas Chair, and lucky for us, she is a current board member and former chair of the board of USGLC. Sarah is a powerhouse and lead advocate for Walmart's legislation and trade negotiations that impact the company's worldwide sourcing, e-commerce, and retail distribution rights. She's also led Walmart's efforts to create and implement their Global Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative. Also joining the panel will be Eddie Acevedo. Eddie is Chief of Staff at the Wilson Center, and I'll let him tell you more about that when he gets up here, where he serves as Senior Advisor to the President and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green. Eddie is a Principal Advisor on National Security and Foreign Policy Matters. He has spent over 15 years in government service at the intersection of domestic and foreign policy, including serving as the U.S. Agency of International Development's National Security Advisor and Principal Liaison to the National Security Council. And joining Sarah and Eddie on the panel, as noted, will be Congressman French Hill, who has represented Arkansas' 2nd Congressional District since 2015. I don't want to give you that long of a tenure, French. In this Congress, French is Vice Chair of the Financial Services Committee, as well as a member of the Foreign Affairs and Intelligence Committee, also chairs the Global Investment in American Jobs Caucus. We all know French has been a long-time accomplished and well-respected business and community leader in Central Arkansas, but noteworthy is that his election to Congress in 2014 was not his first rodeo in the D.C. Beltway. Early in his career, he served in Senate offices, and notably, he previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Corporate Finance in President George H.W. Bush's administration and Executive Secretary to the President's Economic Policy Council, where he coordinated all White House economic policy and for which he received the Distinguished Service Award. Let me say personally, as someone who makes regular visits to D.C. and serves on a national industry board, I'm calling on members of Congress and their staff from many states beyond just my own and visiting with lobbyists who have a good view of the broad landscape in D.C. I hear from many that Arkansas's French Hill is one of the true leaders in the halls of Congress, who is most trusted to understand, explain, and articulate the most complex issues facing our nation. We're fortunate to have him representing us. Please join me in welcoming French Hill to the stage.
Wow. I'm going to sign you up for the eulogy. That was really good. Being respected in Washington, that's a big task. When Speaker Johnson asked me to serve on the House-wide task force on artificial intelligence, I said, well, that's perfect because there's no greater evidence of artificial intelligence than working in Congress. So, what a great day to be with all of you. Great to see our Secretary of State, our Secretary of Commerce, our City Councilman. Jack, congratulations on your recognition. Jack's a former Team Hill intern in Washington, D.C., so I guess we did something right. Congratulations on that, Jack Thomas. Appreciate that. Our members of the General Assembly, thank you for your partnership that we have every single month on behalf of the people of Arkansas to work together in our district. So it's great to be with all of you. Mayor Hartwick, always great to see my friend. Congratulations on the best political outcome there is in life, running unopposed this year. Congratulations on that. History, I want to talk about this theme of the meeting, and I want to start out with this concept that history has a way of upending the best laid plans or any logical outcome. The wishful thinking or even the old admonition of things work out for the best, history has a way of dealing with that. It was a beautiful, calm day until it wasn't. At 4:30 a.m. in Charleston, April 12, 1861, at 7:55 a.m. Honolulu time on December 7th, 1941, at 8:46 on that spectacular early fall day of September 11th, 2001, and horrifically and most recently at 5:07 a.m. on an overcast, cold morning of February 22nd in Kyiv, Ukraine. Wishful thinking is not a strategy. Across our nation, there's a growing movement of wishful thinking that somehow the United States is best when isolated from the woes of war and authoritarian communism and radical religious fanatics who are committed to the death of America or Western values. I witnessed it on the floor of the House of Representatives. I see and hear it daily in the mainstream media and in social media, and I face it with regular conversations here at home. The consistent line goes something like this: we should give no money to other nations because we're running large deficits. We should only spend national security money here on our border and our defense and not the defense of some other nation's freedom or their sovereign border. We should abandon the United Nations or our contributions there just because when we contribute money to the United Nations, we fund those who hate us. We must end our support of Ukraine because Putin has no beef with us. And Ukraine and Crimea are Russia's anyway. and Ukraine is a failed, corrupt state. Some even argue, and I hear it in the House and around the country, why bother to support Taiwan? It belongs to China anyway. So, of course, these type of arguments are not new. We face these movements as a part of our politics since our founding. Yet, in stark contrast, without Allied financial support, no one denies there simply would not be a United States of America. Our beacon of liberty would have been stillborn. Yet, thankfully, the Continental Congress took the risk, based on Benjamin Franklin's wise observation, that we must all hang together or we most assuredly will hang separately, by dispatching Dr. Franklin and John Adams to the French court and to Dutch bankers respectfully to achieve the essential military and financial aid that allowed our nation to be born. It would not have happened. And in a modern context, we've learned the age-old maxim that appeasement does not work. And its successive U.S. presidents in both political parties have urged peace is in fact achieved through strength. Appeasement of Hitler was advocated by many in the 1930s, including famous American flyer Charles Lindbergh and FDR's own ambassador to the court of St. James, Joseph Kennedy. These partners in a Munich mentality were stunned silence when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland. Appeasement coupled with weak, ineffective security capabilities are demonstrated by history and reality to result in failure, misery, and subjugation. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the response to these arguments by the successors to Lindbergh? Sure, our federal spending levels are unsustainable. We all agree on this. And yes, I also agree there could be tremendous improvements in how the Pentagon spends its money. But our support of allies' freedoms and strategic foreign aid in key regions and our global military and economic leadership are not driving federal budget deficits. Our deficits are driven by our collective, bipartisan, unreformed mandatory spending programs and big government advocates inside the government and inside politics that continue to initiate new, massive, multi-trillion-dollar federal spending programs, as well as, from time to time, that overdone and frequently poorly structured intervention by the federal government in the case of a crisis. 2008 and the pandemic being the two most recent examples that layer on unsustainable levels of debt. But those interventions are obviously clouded by what we don't know, the unknown unknowns of any particular matter. But to those Americans that continue to resist NATO, the United Nations, and are cool to our allies in Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, my message is that these institutions and alliances are critical to that fundamental tenet that we've had for decades of peace through strength. America is less prosperous when we abdicate leadership. Global leadership without the United States is like one of the Vice President's Venn diagrams with no intersection. And very importantly, to be a successful peace through strength, it's not achieved alone. This is the lesson of the post-Cold War decades. Looking at the world through the lens of the post-Cold War period, 1945 to 1995, is a mistake. We now reside in a multipolar world with changing alliances and new risks. The binary choice of the Soviet Union versus the United States is dead. In that post-war period, the United States rode in as the cavalry in any conflict pitched as counter to our national interest or to the Western values, or the heads we win, tails you lose conflict with the Soviets. Today, achieving open seas, improved trade market access, deterrence of warfare and invasion on land, under the sea, in space, or via computer network is all at the core of U.S.-led global leadership. But in a multipolar environment, accomplishing these agreed-upon outcomes requires a much more complex diplomacy and partnership. To be against the global order is to be for chaos and expanding threats. This will result in fewer sales and fewer jobs in the world's largest economy and her families, us, our home, our country, the United States. I believe that to be for an American first format, then one has to support U.S. diplomacy, crafting flexible alliances that, while built on the foundations of that post-war period, they're not nostalgic for that foundation. Standing against this global order of open seas, open markets, deterrence, invasion of sovereign countries, safe and secure use of cyber and space are the now self-described axis of resistance: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And in my view, they're very, very active proxies around the world. State actors like Cuba, Syria, and Belarus, non-state fundamentalist terror groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Houthis. Their coordinated malevolence has only grown since 2002, now almost echoing the quaint description by President George W. Bush of this group of actors as the axis of evil. Unfortunately, through resets, unenforced red lines, appeasement, the Obama administration empowered this axis of resistance, and any constraints imposed by Trump officials have, for the most part, been dismantled by the Biden-Harris-Obama 2.0 policies. Iran is now selling 80% of its oil, free from sanctions from the United States, to China. Iran takes that funding and additional funds freed by President Biden and frozen accounts in South Korea and Iraq to build its weapons arsenal and spread disorder, sending drones and missiles to Russia to kill Ukrainians, sending Shia militia groups to Iraq and Syria to protect the murderous Assad regime and kill Americans, along with Syrian women and children, sending missiles and targeting technologies to the Houthi rebels in Yemen to kill Yemenis, attack cargo ships, and U.S. and allied vessels in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, sending money and weapons to Hamas in Gaza to kill Israelis and start this horrendous, now 11-month-long war, sending millions of dollars for weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon to attack and kill Israelis and ensure that beautiful Lebanon is a bankrupt, failed state. China and North Korea are aiding Russia with the material necessary for their continued economic advance as it bombs children's hospitals in Kyiv. North Korea and Iran continue to advance their offensive nuclear capabilities. And in the midst of an invasion of Ukraine, Russia, according to public reporting, is launching a nuclear weapon in space, in violation of treaties and as a threat to the entire global civilization, including their Axis partners. In December 1950, Time magazine quoted one of Putin's great role models, Lenin, as saying, "The road to Paris lies through Peking," signaling that Russia will partner with China to advance the global domination of communism. Never has that statement, now some 80 years later, been more true. These new authoritarian Axis powers have set out to achieve global domination by way of countering the United States and the rule of law and poisoning the minds of millions by cyber warfare propaganda. To preserve our economic vitality and opportunity for our future, the United States and like-minded partners and peoples around the world must echo Churchill and its commitment to repel the Nazis. We must commit to fight this toxic blend of communism and terror on the beaches, in the streets, on the seas, in the air, but also, and importantly, on the network and in orbit. Failure to do so will impoverish our economic future, and our American spirit also will be impoverished by us violating Kennedy's promise in his inaugural address. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. And if that's not enough to convince you, maybe you'll stick in this multipolar world with an old Chinese proverb, one of Mao's favorites. You have to choose between killing the tiger or being eaten by it. Thank you very much. Glad to be with everybody.
Wow, Congressman Hill, that was an amazing history, current events, future lesson. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I'm going to give you a few minutes to take a sip of water, and so I'm going to start with a question for all three of you. Eddie, I will start with you and come down. This is more of a big picture question to get our discussion started, and all three of you have front row seats to the threats and challenges facing America today from different points of view. As was mentioned earlier, Congressman, you sit on three key committees: financial services, foreign affairs, and intelligence. Eddie, you have served both in the legislative and executive branches in foreign policy and at U.S. Agency for International Development. And then, of course, Sarah, you work for one of the largest companies in the country that's headquartered right here in Arkansas. So you really come at this from three different perspectives. So, Eddie, I'll start with you. Given the stakes for the United States and threats and challenges and opportunities that we have for our security and our economy, why is U.S. engagement, particularly through the lens of development diplomacy, and not just the military, part of our national security in addressing these threats and challenges that we have?
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I'm going to ask for the audience to give a round of applause to the Congressman.
Thank you.
I wish every member of Congress spoke like that. Thank you very much to USGLC for inviting me to be here, and it's an honor. I'm going to give one example, which is not theory, it's recent history of something that I think the Congressman touched upon, which is this notion that isolationism leads to a void that's not filled for the bad guys that leads to chaos. I'm paraphrasing. But Yemen is a perfect example of this. So in Yemen, many years ago, the Saudis and the Emiratis said, we see the Houthis as a threat to our national security. We're going to engage in a military conflict. They did that for years. The U.S. provided very little assistance. At one point, the most we did was just some ISR support, but that was about it. Then, after such a long time, they decided to pull out. Then the Houthis decided, we're going to attack Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. In their words, it was their version of a 9/11. The U.S. did nothing to support those efforts. And then we decide, after so many years, and the Congressman knows this, of the U.S. asking the Saudis and the Houthis and the Emiratis to stop the war, we decided, the U.S., to engage. And now U.S. coalition forces are actually bombing the Houthis, which is a terrorist element. My point of that story is, if we would have paid attention 10 years ago, when this thing began, maybe we'll not be in this situation. I'll give you a bit of a headline. The Houthis back then never had ballistic missiles. Guess what? They don't manufacture that in Sana'a. They got that from the Iranians. And now they're shooting at us, U.S. ships, coalition ships. This is what's happening. In Russia, same thing. A lot of people talk about Crimea. Well, guess what? Before they took Crimea, they took Georgia. They took a piece of Georgia. The country, not the state. I always have to make sure I clarify that, because then people living in Georgia come after me. But they took a piece of Georgia. Then they took Crimea, and we did nothing. And then we're shocked when they go into Kyiv. So I say that as just two small but real-world examples on what happens when American leadership is not there. But then what happens when American leadership is there? To me, the best success story of American leadership in recent history is Colombia. Colombia is a country that at one point was dealing with a civil war with a terrorist element as well. They still have some remnants of it, but not to the degree they used to have. We went in with what we call in DC hard power, soft power, economic power. We went hard power first, provided them the security assistance they needed to stabilize our country from a security standpoint. We went soft power with USAID and other elements to boost up their capacity. And then we went economic power and gave them a free trade agreement. And now Colombia is thriving. But we take our successes for granted. You know, it's interesting, as somebody who worked on the Hill, there's always the fights over what we disagree on, and very rarely do we appreciate what we do agree on. So for 6, 7, 8 months, around the world, internationally, and in the US, we all talked about and conspired that Congress was not going to get done a supplemental to help Ukraine, help our allies. It just couldn't get done. It was impossible. There was no way it was going to happen. You all heard this rhetoric, all the talking heads, for 6, 7, 8 months. Then they pulled it off. And that was maybe, what, 2, 3 day story? Hey, we got it done. Great. After the third day, we all moved on. My point in that is, I understand that in the media, there's a lot of, they show a lot about division. I get it. Sells papers, gives folks coverage. But in the world of foreign affairs, here's a dirty little secret of Washington. No political party can get anything done when it comes to foreign affairs on their own. Cannot be done. It is logistically impossible. They gotta have some compromise from the other side, whoever's in the majority, whoever's in the minority. And the role that the US Congress has to play in foreign policy is something that is awfully forgotten. And that, I think, is gonna be instrumental. Because as we're dealing with all these multiple crises happening around the world, the Congress, in a bipartisan way, can help fill some of that void, some of that leadership. When we're talking about America leadership, we say America leadership. We don't say the White House leadership. We don't say the president leadership. We say America leadership, and that includes our executive and legislative branches, and we can't forget that.
So Eddie, I really appreciate that you brought that up about the bipartisan nature of American foreign policy and development and diplomacy. Because for years upon years upon years, it has been one issue that has not been caught in the politics of America. And so one of the reasons why we do these is to keep and maintain that position so that when the media doesn't tell a story, that we are sharing with others. And so members of Congress will hear from their constituents just how vital these issues are. So Sarah, let me turn to you and just look at it from an economic perspective and our interest in our security.
Sure. So Walmart is in 19 countries around the world. We source from an additional 80 countries. And even though 2/3 of what we source for our U.S. stores are grown, made, or assembled in the United States, we can't make everything. And certainly if you want bananas, we can't grow them here. So we are inextricably linked to the global economy. And let me just give you 2 examples that you talked about. Ukraine. When we saw the challenges in Ukraine and we were seeing the intelligence community, we did sort of a gut assessment. What does this mean for Walmart? And we thought, okay, we don't have stores in Ukraine. We do a little bit of work on tech, but it was really the second and third order issues that we were really concerned about. Ukraine produces an enormous amount of wheat, and a lot of that wheat goes to Africa. And immediately we thought we were just coming out of COVID, and prices were already high. And if you actually, and they did, block the ports, that wheat can't go out, and the prices are going to go up because somebody's going to have to fill that gap. And that's what we saw. Same thing with sunflower oil, because they produce quite a bit of sunflower. And so what we were seeing as Walmart, and why it matters here, is the prices did go up for many food stocks until we could get those shipments moving again. And moreover, in Africa, people became very food insecure, and food insecurity leads to instability. So those second, third, and fourth order issues are particularly important for us. And if we don't have U.S. leadership there calming the waters, then you see what happens. Same thing. I mean, I never thought I'd have to care about the Houthis, but the Houthis are actually bombing U.S. and other flagship commercial vehicles in the Strait of Hormuz, which goes through the Suez Canal, at the same time that the Panama Canal was having a drought. So all of a sudden, all those boats have to go around the Horn of Africa and come to the United States, which again, increased costs. All of the ships and all of your containers get out of whack because there's sort of a system to it. And the costs, unfortunately, redound on U.S. consumers. And so that's just a way to say that we see very much that economic security and national security are very interlinked. And that's sort of the challenge side. We can talk a little bit more about the opportunity side and how we work with U.S. government agencies to promote economic development, which I think is also a more positive story.
Can I just add one
Yeah,
thing
please.
to that? So one aspect where we need a little bit more integration is, I'll give you an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the big talking points was we need to diversify the Europeans away from their dependency on Russian oil, right? You all heard this, right? You know what you didn't hear? We need to diversify the Europeans away from Russian wheat. You didn't hear that. Until this day, the U.S. biggest competitor on the wheat side is Russia. Yet we have done nothing to hit the Russians on this. And imagine, this is where sort of the agriculture community and the national security community need to come together. Because guess what? If we can hit Russian wheat, one, you take away dollars to the regime. Two, you make the rest of the region diversify, which is good for us. And three, it helps our ag industry in the U.S. It's a win-win-win. And it helps the Ukrainians. And yet we haven't done it.
I don't know. I don't love playing with food security, but that's another.
Congressman, anything you want to add here?
Well, I think the sanctions against Russia have been largely not as successful as people would like. I'll never forget the week after the invasion, we're on a house-wide conference call with Secretary Yellen, and I said, well, if we're trying to limit Russia, why do we want to be importing 600,000 barrels of Russian oil to the United States every day? She goes, we don't import Russian oil every day. I said, we do. And if we were serious about this, we'd stop it tomorrow. And she did a month later. But I mean, we have a lack of information about these supply chains sometimes. We were importing that oil, by the way, because our own regulations in the U.S. make it very difficult to transport oil on a U.S. flag vessel from Houston to Boston, where it was being refined. So it's cheaper for Bostonians to import Russian oil than oil from Texas. That's
One issue at a time.
That's a whole other story.
We'll work on that issue.
But this issue of it's on gas and food. I mean, I think Europe. President Biden took the decision that on sanctions, he would only do the sanctions he could get consensus on in the G7. Now, we could debate that, seriously debate that. And a lot of us have taken pot shots on that mix of sanctions that the administration put in place. But he thought that would give the best chance at enforceability against Russia. But Russia still is exporting aluminum, gas, food, obviously oil to all over the world. And people are buying it, which means they're violating the sanctions. So we've damaged the Russian economy, but we haven't crippled it like I think people thought. And part of it is because of those decisions that you have European consensus on it, on the food piece, because we didn't want to drive up prices any worse than they were already being driven up. I think you could have been tougher. But that is the balance between Sarah's view and Eddie's, I think.
So can we drill down a little bit more and go to another part of the country, and that's China. And I think all of us hear daily about competition with China, and I know this is an important issue for you, Congressman. So the People's Republic of China is really rapidly increasing its military buildup in the Indo-Pacific. And you mentioned this in your remarks. And they're expanding their influence all across the world, Africa, Central South America, and so on, and threatening our allies and partners, Taiwan being one of them. And really, all of these things are challenging our economic interests and our security. And so as a member of the House Intel Committee, you really have this unique perspective on the People's Republic of China and what they've been doing across the globe. I was stunned when I saw that Chinese investments in the developing world have increased a whopping 525% over the last 15 years, and they were already investing a lot. And when you visited East Asia on several different occasions, one of the occasions you asserted that the United States, quote, must have an equally well-articulated multilateral economic policy deterrence for China's potential malign activities, end quote. So what does this economic policy look like? And how is global development a part of this equation as you're thinking about these economic policies? And really, what happens if we don't address this? How does that impact our own peace and security?
Well, first, I'm not in the camp that says China is 10 feet tall. I'm in the camp that thinks that China is actually a country in trouble right now, serious trouble politically and economically. And so you don't get that theme. If you read closely, you can find that, but they have a rapidly declining population due to bad decisions they made. These investments you talk about globally, many of them have been done in a poor way, and they're going to have huge losses in those investments. They have no social safety net in their economy, and they think of themselves as the Middle Kingdom. This is if you've read James Clavell, if you know Asian history, China considers itself the Middle Kingdom. I mean, it is the most important country in the world in their thousands of years of history. Everything else revolves around it. So they refer to themselves as the Middle Kingdom. But what they're really in is an enormous middle income trap, which countries find themselves in. So they're at that point where they could become South Korea or Taiwan or Nigeria, but on an enormous scale because of billions of people. And I'm making a bet they find their way through this, but they are in a very troubled economic time. They're disproportionately investing probably in the wrong things, you might say, but that's because they have no market economy. To counter them economically, and I argue in my talk, it's a multipolar world. So it is not something that the United States can do alone. And then if you think that the G7 countries get on the same page about stuff, well, that's like saying the city council's on the same page as stuff, you know. It's hard work, right? You got to get 6 votes to move an idea forward. Well, in the G7, it's a much more, one person can take it down, which waters down things. And so if you want to have economic diplomacy, military diplomacy, and then classic statecraft, and you're going to try to do it by consensus, that's tough. But an example would be, in the Asian sphere of influence, you would have, these are the goals we have for economic development from Australia to the Philippines to the greater Pacific Basin. And you would say, well, we can't do that by ourselves in the United States. We're going to help lay out the strategy, but we're counting on South Korean, Japanese, other partners of ours to participate in that. And that's how you have to operate to counter that. Secondly, the U.S. does have disproportionate leadership at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we need to use that to constrain China being treated like a developing country. It shouldn't be. And secondly, that they have been let off the hook on how they've done these loans in their Belt and Road program. It's predatory. Ask the Ecuadorians if they like borrowing money from China. Ask the Sri Lankans if they like borrowing money from China. The answer is no. They leave a wasteland of destruction in their wake. So you have to do it multilaterally, I think, to be the most successful, and U.S. leadership has to be plugged in. And we have to we want it a certain outcome. We can't be, well, let's just all agree. We have to take that leadership position. Final comment. For us to counter China in the global south, both in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa, and in some parts of Asia, we got to check this political agenda at home. When you go to Uganda and they say, we'd like help in building an airport or a port, the Ugandans, I can't do it in their native language, but they have a little one-liner for that, which is, when we ask the EU or the United States for development assistance, we get a lecture. We ask China for it, we get a port. Now, it's not very well built, and I got a million problems with it, but we are demanding that this Roman Catholic country, have a same-sex marriage law and an abortion law. I mean, a permissive law on what we would be battling here in our country. This is a developing nation. We should be drilling water wells, building ports, not exporting, our hardcore political agenda there. You can give a démarche to a government, meaning you can say, Mr. Ambassador, we've been asked to say this, but you don't tie that kind of aid to it. I think it's gotten, and then climate change is the other one. It's destroying these countries. And when you destroy a country, do you want all those people to, I was just in Nigeria last month. I mean, it's falling apart. Yep. And so you want those 200 million people migrating to Europe? So we need to get our act together on military and economic needs to be coordinated, and then I think on a bilateral basis, or EU and the U.S. need to tone it down on our exporting our developed countries' sophisticated social policy onto countries that are, Muslim countries or Roman Catholic countries that don't fit. We're not winning when we're doing that, in my opinion.
Meeting people where they are.
You got to meet people where they are. It doesn't mean you can't advocate for adequate family planning, rights for women. I'm not talking about not advocating for it, but I'm seeing it. I've been on too many of these trips over the last 9.5 years. I've witnessed too much of it. I was in Erbil, trying to talk about Baghdad and Erbil getting back on the same page as relating to exporting oil and gas, benefiting the citizens in both the north of Iraq and Baghdad. I'm sitting in this meeting. I have invited the Roman Catholic bishop of the region to the meeting with me. It's my meeting, and our U.S. Diplomat comes in and says, well, Congressman, I want to, in front of the bishop here, just remind you what a fantastic progress we're making on same-sex marriage here in the north of Iraq. And I'm going, well, but we're not here to talk about that, Mr. Ambassador. We're here to talk about economics, military assistance, the Iranian threat over the border, trying to get cooperation from Turkey to turn the oil exports back on, and getting a cooperative arrangement between the federal capital of Baghdad and the Kurdistan region. And it's not what we're here to talk about. And members of Congress, this is what we talk about among ourselves. And you could probably flip it in some conservative administration and have a list of things too. I'll be bipartisan in that sense. But we are not handling, our development assistance in the right way, in my vision. We really aren't.
That's why I thought it was so profound, Ronald Reagan's comment that our politics stops at our water's edge. I think that used to infiltrate everything. Before we go on, the note cards on your table aren't just for jotting down your thoughts on American global leadership. We want to bring you all into this conversation as well. So if you all have questions for any of our panelists, not me, but the others, please write them down. My colleague will just lift them up in the air. My colleague will walk around and grab them. I do ask, I need a new prescription for my glasses, so write as clearly as possible in print so I can read them. But until we get some of those questions, Eddie, I'm going to throw it to you. And let's talk about fragile states and national security, obviously something you're passionate about. I mentioned earlier about extreme poverty, and 73% of the world's extreme poor live in fragile and violent environments. This makes them more vulnerable to health crises, natural disasters, and importantly, extremist groups where terrorist organizations often recruit. American investments help to stabilize these communities while simultaneously protecting ourselves, particularly when it comes to health and wellness, as we just saw with COVID. And during your time at USAID, you saw this all firsthand. So the strategic investments we've been talking about here today and strengthening global stability, how does that prevent weak and fragile states from erupting into conflict and then ultimately keeping us safer at home?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think focusing on prevention is obviously the key, right? It's sort of like, you know, if somebody unfortunately gets a diagnosis for cancer, you would rather get it stage 1 than stage 4, right? I think when it comes to the fragility side, what we know and we've witnessed across the Middle East, Latin America, across the Sahel and Africa, is that fragile countries are breeding grounds for terrorism, trafficking, transnational crime. All of these elements will come together. The important part are those investments to keep a country from becoming a fragile state. So, for example, as the Congressman mentioned on the China piece, you know, I sort of crack up when people talk about strategic competition with China. I tell folks, you know, in my world, if we're competing, that means we're going head to head. For many of these countries, we're not even in the ball game. We're not even on the field. I mean, there's been many examples where China would win bids for certain projects across the world, and it becomes front page news, and everybody goes nuts, and everybody goes to that country on the U.S. side, how dare you go with China? And the response is always the same thing. Nobody from the U.S. bid. So we're not even competing. It would be different if we were competing and losing, but we're not even competing. So that is where those investments are crucial, because for a lot of the private sector, for Walmart now, I'm not going to speak for Walmart, but I'm going to give you a hypothetical for Walmart, right? Walmart is probably going to want to invest in a stable country. Walmart is probably going to want to invest in a country that has some sort of decent governance, rule of law, right? And the countries that don't have any of that, Walmart, as in addition to many other countries, will say, this may be too risky of an investment for us, right? And that's where our tools come into place to strengthen those entities. But the problem is that our tools, whether it's USAID, DFC, USTDA, I mean, every acronym under the sun, they're very good, but they do need to be updated. They do need to be reformed. They need to build flexibility. We need to build speed. I mean, things are happening quicker now than they used to. And back in the day, it was sort of good enough to say to these countries, hey, but like, you know, we're the US, come on. And they'll be like, okay, fine. Nowadays, we have to offer an alternative. For so many years, we've gone to countries, for example, on the 5G Huawei, and we tell countries, don't go with Huawei, don't go with China. And they'll say, great, where's your alternative? Oh, well, we don't have one, but don't do it. And for these elements, this is something that we need to look a little bit more inward as opposed to just poking the finger at China. We need to get our own house in order. For example, trade. Trade, unfortunately, has gone by the wayside. And China is gobbling up trade deals left and right. Just in this hemisphere, in the last 2 or 3 years, Ecuador and Uruguay, I'm going to pick 2 countries, Ecuador and Uruguay begged, literally pleaded, begged the U.S., please give us a free trade agreement, pretty please. We want to be your friend. We're pro-U.S., please. We said, no, thank you. So they said, okay, and they went and they signed free trade agreements with China. And just like that example, there's many other examples in other regions of similar countries making the same decisions. So part of this discussion frankly, is getting our house in order so that we can compete. But we're not there yet.
Sarah, since Walmart's name has been invoked, we'll do this like the debate. 30 seconds to respond if you have a response.
Yeah, no, obviously we invest where we have good rule of law and security. And just to, because you guys are a bit of downers, just to be a little bit more positive, you know, when we invest, and we are in 19 countries around the world, what we want to see in those economies around where we have stores and clubs are healthy and growing economies and growing communities. And the best way to do that for us is to give economic development opportunities. And what we have, quite frankly, is we hire a lot of people and we buy a lot of stuff. And so our approach in many ways to partnering on economic development and to creating those economic opportunities is to say, how do we make that purchase order more available to everybody? So that's great if you have lots of big companies in your market, but many, many of these markets, whether we're in Central America or in India, it's a lot of smaller sellers, a lot of smaller businesses, smaller ag. And that's where actually the international agencies, whether it's USAID or DFC and others, are actually really well poised to help us, because we can say, I want to buy tomatoes. But if you don't know what the growing standards are, if you don't really understand how to do distribution, it's awful hard for a smallholder farmer to actually sell to Walmart. And that's where we've really partnered very effectively with the development agencies to say, if you guys train, or if you get an NGO to help us train these farmers, we can buy. And then we can create a virtuous and sustainable cycle of economic development. We've done that with underserved populations, with women. And it's not just in emerging markets. What's interesting, too, as we're growing our marketplace, e-commerce, we're working with the Commerce Department here in the United States to train U.S. small businesses to be able to export to Canada and Mexico, because we'll have one integrated marketplace, but the rules are different or the financing options are different. So that's where the U.S. Commerce Department is helping us export products. And so that's our role, is to say, as we grow, we want to grow really in an inclusive way, and the best way to do that is to partner with these agencies. So yes, they can be more flexible, but we've seen a lot of opportunity and innovation when we come and we say, we're doing this great project, y'all can help us, and we can talk. I know Representative Bear has been bending your ear on our project in the Pacific Islands on tuna, which is a development project that Walmart put together with the Nature Conservancy. Saw that there were some market failures, like, it'd be really helpful if, like, the Marshall Islands had better infrastructure here, if we could train their workforce, and the development community came in behind us to help us solve those market failures. And that supports a geopolitical issue, right? We would like to have better relationships within the Pacific Island nations. It solves an economic issue, and it solved a social issue where a lot of they weren't getting the economic rents for a lot of the fishing. So those are the kind of things that we want to see more. It's the kind of innovation we think, if we have development opportunities that are very private sector led, that are sustainable and have good, clear outcomes. And I know your boss was a big advocate about this and a path to self-reliance. Those are the kinds of things I think we can all do together.
Eddie's boss being former Ambassador Mark Green, who was the administrator of USAID. So just wanted to clarify that. So Sarah, let me pick up on that a little bit. And ask you to just elaborate, bring it back a little more local. We know 310,000 jobs in Arkansas are here because of trade. That's nearly 20% of the workforce in this state. So as you are talking about these great partnerships that Walmart is doing, the wonderful things you all are doing internationally, why would someone sitting in this room, or when you're going to the grocery store and you hear some of the things that you all have mentioned, or why are we putting our money overseas, what's that connection?
Yeah, so we have a building in Bentonville, Arkansas called the International Building. And those are all people who are dedicated to essentially supporting our international operations. So it's all of the sourcing teams and the finance teams and the marketing teams and the advertising teams and the marketplace teams. So because we are growing internationally, and we're one of the only retailers, actually, if you think about it, U.S. retailers that have a global presence, the more we grow internationally, the more we can grow here. Kind of makes sense, right? Because we're going to have the support services. Similarly, you know, for us, we want to have products and services for our consumers here in the United States that meet what they want and what they need. And what we find is just great innovation. you know, a lot of the kinds of things, like what we find now is people, what people want more than anything is time. So we're reconfiguring our whole business to really address that issue. But some of the greatest ideas about click and collect, right? You can shop online and then somebody will come and put your groceries in your car, or, you know, even into your refrigerator. A lot of that innovation comes from our overseas markets. So getting those ideas, being able to implement, a lot of international markets have just really advanced further on e-commerce and e-commerce delivery. And so taking those best practices back here, and I guess it comes back to what I started with, which is we live in a global economy. There's no way truly to decouple from the world. And so the best we can do is to be competitive. And we have the best talent, we have the best opportunities. And so that's where, for Walmart, you know, being in a global economy, thinking very inclusively on how we source and how we grow jobs benefits people here in the United States.
So you didn't invoke Eddie's name, but Eddie looks like he wants to jump in.
Yeah, so just one quick thing to sort of bring it back to Arkansas, right? Your largest trading partner is Canada, and your number 2 is Mexico. So if I'm living in Arkansas, your number 1 issue should be USMCA, which is coming up for renewal in 2026.
You gave him an acronym.
Oh, sorry, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Now that comes up for renewal in 2026, and here's a harsh reality. Many of the members of Congress that first voted for USMCA are no longer in Congress. So now we're dealing with a lot of new members of Congress that have to be educated about the importance and the impact that USMCA has in our country. Now, you may think to yourself, well, that's 2026, Eddie. We have plenty of time for that. True, but right now, we are in a dispute with Mexico about constitutional reforms that they're trying to ram through. And that is having a geopolitical impact, because now Mexico yesterday responded in saying, we're going to pause our relationship, whatever that means, with the US and Canada. So anything that messes with USMCA will and could have a direct impact on Arkansas.
So I have a stack of questions from the audience here, but there are 2 things I want to make sure to get to. So Congressman Hill, both of these are for you because you have shown such leadership on 2 pieces of legislation that I think I would love to hear more from you about on. And one is the Repo Act. And you have shepherded the Repo Act that allows Russian sovereign assets to be held that are held in the United States to be confiscated and used for Ukraine's reconstruction at such time that we get there. So if you talk to us a little more about that, and then the other legislation I would love to hear more from you is the illicit financing. And that's earlier this year, the Treasury Department issued its strategy to combat illicit financing, citing its threat to our national security, our economic prosperity, and our democratic values. And so you have been quoted as saying, quote, as bad actors become more proficient, regulators and law enforcement must continue to increase their own capabilities and expertise. So if you could just share more about both of those pieces.
Well, the Repo Act was a bill that originally I introduced and called it the Ukraine Reconstruction Act, and it was taking all the Russian assets held outside Russia that had been frozen subject to both UN and multilateral and bilateral sanctions. And so not just the Russian central bank, not their Federal Reserve, but all Russian assets have been frozen, and convert those to use for Ukraine, for rebuilding, because Russia is systematically destroying that country. It passed through the House. We had it through the Foreign Affairs Committee and through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Basically 30 to 1 or 30 to 2 good votes in both houses. I took all my parameters and put them in a guy named Mike McCall, the chairman of the committee's bill. He's from Central Texas, Austin. So we got that bill passed and signed into law. But we give the president extraordinary authority here, but President Biden's choosing not to use it. And I'm not going to say it's because he wouldn't possibly use it. It gets back to the point I made earlier, which is it's been vetoed by Germany inside the G7 to use it. It's a huge mistake. I've met with the National Security Council staff on this. I've not talked to President Biden about it personally, but we've had intensive work here because you're letting them off the hook. We're not sending that sort of ultimate financial economic penalty, which is you've started this war, you're killing babies in children's hospitals, and we're not going to let you get away without paying for it. So it is a classic reparation. We have everybody on the left and the right supports my view on this. So Lawrence Tribe, the very well-respected left of center jurist at the federal level, has written a treatise this thick saying that what we're proposing is right, it's justified under the just war doctrine, and we did this in the United States against Saddam Hussein. We took Iraqi frozen assets and gave that money to Kuwait for Kuwait's rebuilding after the invasion there in 1990 and 91, and we've done it also vis-a-vis Iran. So we know we're legally justified, but the leader of Germany says we're not, and that it has, and so he has vetoed inside the G7 this stronger position. So what they've agreed to do is take those Russian assets in Brussels that are frozen in the central bank, it's about a little over $200 billion, and they're using the interest off that account, claiming, well, we froze it when you invaded Ukraine, so the interest is what we're using, and they could use the interest to back a sovereign bond issue or use it directly, so it could be as collateral or direct use. This is insufficient in my view. So we're still pressing Europe and Washington to do what I think we ought to be doing. And this will send the right signal, I think, to the Russians. On your other point on illicit finance, I've authored the legislation, it's bicameral now, bipartisan House legislation on regulating cryptocurrencies and how to create a marketplace for digital assets in the U.S. so it's competitive. So that if Walmart wanted to partner with a firm and create its own tokenized payment on a Walmart global blockchain, they would be able to do that consistent with U.S. law. It says what's a commodity, what's a security, but it also has the Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering rules for digital that we have for cash or we have for checks or we have for wire transfers today. And we want to eliminate this extraterritorial illicit finance in cash, $100 bills, which is where it mostly happens. We export a lot of $100 bills every year, and through the banking system to add crypto to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership on both of those. Okay, I just want to make sure you don't want to chime in. So turning to some of the audience questions. So we've talked a lot about security, both national security from a military perspective and economic security. And so I guess this is going to go to all three of you. Is there a reason to support development and diplomacy outside of the military national security, the economic security, but just based off of humanitarian values?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, and I think the U.S. has had that point of view since we've become a modern country in the 20th century, 21st century context. Even in the reparations against China in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, China, the Empress Dowager, had to pay reparations to all the Christian countries because the Boxers in Shanghai and Beijing were murdering Christians in the streets, and they settled that in a global settlement. They had to pay reparations there, and President Theodore Roosevelt took our share of the reparations and turned it into a scholarship program for Chinese citizens to come study in the United States. This was in 1903, so a long predecessor to the Fulbright type program. So humanitarian reason is a good reason. President Bush, PEPFAR was a great example of President George W. Bush to stop HIV/AIDS at the origins in Africa, on the continent of Africa, for humanitarian purposes. It happens to be one of the most significant foreign diplomacy activities we've ever undertaken and one of the most successful, which is a lot better than building a failed dam in Ecuador by China. And so there is an ethical element in it. And that's why I say, like speaking as a Rotarian, we should be doing the water wells, building the dams, doing PEPFAR because it's the right thing to do, and not connecting it to some, social policy in the United States if a country's poor. So I think there's always been that, and we have a whole ecosystem, not just in the federal government, but around the world, that want to lift our brothers and sisters out of poverty. And you gave a great example in your opening comments about what free trade, free market economics, American leadership, the post-war foundation that I addressed has done to lift people out of poverty. That won't stop them from buying Huawei, but it's a start.
Well, and just to pick up on that PEPFAR,
Yeah.
25 years later, 30 million lives saved. And that means fewer orphans in Africa. That means more people being able to put more into their own economy and create their own stability. So it really was, or is, an amazing program that really shows the best of America.
Yeah, it's a lot better than Belt and Road.
Yes.
A lot more significant. And it puts your best foot forward in Cameroon or in Nigeria or in Ghana, where we also have a military partnership to counter the Wagner Group and the incredible expansion of terrorism in West Africa. But at the heart of that is the trust and bonding that took place over the last 2 decades through President Bush's initiative on PEPFAR.
Eddie, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just going to say on PEPFAR, I do believe it is one of the most successful foreign aid programs that we've ever done. Now we need to get it reauthorized, so that's still lingering. But I think if we can get that done, that would send a very powerful message to Africa and the rest of the countries who take advantage of PEPFAR. On humanitarian assistance, I'm a firm believer that the American people are compassionate and that our nation is compassionate. And humanitarian assistance is one way that we do show our compassion. We are the #1 largest humanitarian donor in the world. If you add up 2 through 10, they still don't beat us if you accumulate that together, and we would still be #1. Now, the issue that we're having due to the budgetary constraints is that there's more humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian assistance was based on a theory that these crises are moderately short-term. The problem is that now they've become protracted, long crises. So like, for example, I'll give you one tidbit that you may find surprising. So the largest humanitarian migration crisis in the world today, it's not Syria, it's not Ukraine, it's not Gaza, it's Venezuela. A country that about 8 to 9 million people have fled because of the dictatorship, okay? And this has been going on now for over a decade. I say that because the system was not built to deal with a protracted humanitarian crisis. And because we are a compassionate nation, something has to give. And that something is the traditional development assistance. So in the last state foreign ops bill that got passed, unfortunately, there was a 10% cut to the development assistance and the economic support fund accounts because the humanitarian numbers are going up. So it goes back to the conversation we had about prevention. We need to remember that the more dollars we put into prevention and traditional development, that would help us be able to contain and mitigate these crises. But ultimately, that's where the 3 components, military, diplomacy, and development, need to work together. The U.S. we've become used to this notion of, well, for the sake of stability. Let's just keep this contained for the sake of stability. But stability a lot of times doesn't solve the problem. And these things just grow and get worse off as the years go on. So the more focus we can put in some of these crises to help solve the problem itself, the better it is for us long term.
So I have 3 more questions I'm going to give to each of you, and then I have one last question to close this up. So as quickly as possible, these are questions from the audience. Sarah, to you, somebody's been doing their research on Walmart. It's about women and girls. And asking you to share a personal story or example of Walmart's initiative with women and girls and the impact that it has, the work that you all have done around women and girls. Eddie, to you,
You were just talking about Venezuela. Your question is about authoritarianism in Latin America and what are some of the root causes of migration. So then Congressman Hill, to you, is about the rise of AI. You had mentioned that earlier in your remarks. And how does that impact our national security, especially as it's related to China and our other adversaries, and what are we doing to combat these threats? So Sarah, we'll start with you on women and girls.
Yeah, sure. So, we're a big grocer, and if you think about how your household shops, women tend to make most of the decisions about that spend. It's about $20 trillion or so dollars in spend. And we looked at what we were doing and thought, we could probably be more intentional about making sure we have the products and services that match those women shoppers. So we really looked at a value chain approach and said, where do we interact with women on farms, as women-owned businesses, thinking about our suppliers, and thought we could probably do better. We traditionally, big businesses spend about 1% of their negotiable spend with like women-owned businesses, and we thought we probably can do a lot better. So we put a goal out there, which was to source $20 billion in U.S. spend for women-owned businesses. Happy to say we met and exceeded that goal. But what it means for us is, one, we have products and services that are more aligned with our shoppers. So, like, if you've ever had a kid, like, all of a sudden, like, why can't we put the baby food in a pouch? I guarantee a woman came up with that idea because, like, this doesn't make any sense. So we had better, more aligned products and services. Women tend to hire more women. So around the world, we did this globally. What we saw was those women leaders were hiring more women and more spend, and so it created this virtuous cycle. And then what we also saw is that in many economies where those women became powerful women leaders, they became more invested in their communities. So they ran for city council because they were like, wait a minute, I'm paying taxes and I want to know where those taxes are going. So it's one of those things that it seems self-evident, but at the time we actually had to make the business case. So we got McKinsey in and we showed that the inventory controls were better for our merchants, that their sales were better. And now it's not so much that we're doing just for women. What is it? Is it on us? Do we need to figure out how we do our supplier administration better? Do we actually have to figure out better financing or distribution, or the things that would impact whether you're a veteran or any other business that probably should be on our shelves because people want your products and services? So it was a good thing to do at the time. I would say now we're just more about, like, how do we help small businesses? How do we help small farmers? How do we help those groups that you live in your communities? They are the lifeblood of your communities, become part of our ecosystem. Because then we're really, like we say, we have stores of the community. When you shop, you're like, well, I go to my Walmart. That really matters when you see the products from your community on our shelves, and so we want to do that globally.
Wonderful. So Eddie, to you, we're running quick, so a minute. Rise of authoritarianism in a minute.
Oh boy! All right. So long story short, multiple administrations like to focus in other regions. And we neglect the Western Hemisphere. This is our region. Our number one and number two oil comes from this region. Most of our trade and our economic prosperity is tied to this region. So what happened in this region should matter to every American. Now, the rise of authoritarianism is causing a few different elements to happen. First is migration. A few weeks ago, I was in the Darien jungle in Panama, looking at the migrants coming through. 70% of the migrants that are coming through Venezuela because, again, they're fleeing Maduro. 70%. Now, there's 20 other nationalities that are coming through all over the world, but the majority is coming from Venezuela. One of the things that I think a lot of times we make this mistake is, well, when it comes to migration, it's all about the U.S.-Mexico border. No. If we have bad folks coming through, if we have terrorists coming through, do you want to catch them on the U.S.-Mexico border? Or would you rather catch them a little further down south, right? You would want to catch them further down south. When I was in Costa Rica, the Costa Ricans told me, hey, guess what? We have caught 18 terrorists in the last 2 years. All right? So this is a serious element because you have one side of it, which is the Venezuelan side. That dictator is because of his mismanagement, corruption, human rights violations, stealing elections, et cetera, killing people, throwing them in jail. All that is causing immigration to go up. Then you have another dictator in Ortega in Nicaragua who says, hey, I'm going to make money off of this. So Nicaragua has now become the migration hub for the world. The migrants are coming in from the south, so Ortega and his murderous regime is making money that way. And then they have these charter flights coming in from all over the world who land in Managua, and then from there they go up. So you have another dictator who's doing that. And then Ortega says, well, that's not enough. What else can I do on the US? Well, let me bring in the Russians. So now the Russians have a spy facility in Managua. And then the Cubans say, well, we want to get in on this party, so let's bring in China. And now China has a spy and military facility in Cuba. And all of that, you got the Russians bringing in their subs through this region and some of their military toys through this region. So we need to put more attention towards the Western Hemisphere. Our prosperity and our security are directly tied to this region.
Eddie took a little bit of your time, but I'm going to turn to you for the last one of AI.
You're allowed to extend your remarks.
Yeah. Artificial intelligence is in everything that we're doing, in every application of our personal lives, our business lives, our academic lives, and it's going to only grow. Many consumer and commercial benefits to it, and the Congress is in conversations about, well, what's the proper oversight there? What are the guiding principles? And human in the loop is number one. Reminding people who use AI to attract new customers or develop new products that they still have to comply with federal law. And really, having a human in the loop and complying with federal law, that absolves a lot of the short-term risks, I think, in how AI is rolling out inside the U.S. But on your national security point, this is critical because AI, artificial intelligence, quantum computing will revolutionize the entire surveillance system in the world, both I would say corporate surveillance, meaning private surveillance activities, as well as public surveillance, both military and non-military intelligence sources. And so it's top of mind, and the U.S. is a leader there, and I'll leave it at that. And we are devoting a lot of resources to both the oversight, the application, and countering our adversaries in that space.
So last question, very, very quickly. I'm not letting y'all off the hook. I asked everyone here with us today to jot down what American global leadership meant to them and to Arkansas. So 10 words or less, I'm asking the three of you. Addie, I'll start with you. What does American global leadership mean? What's it worth?
I mean, Jesus. Look, I know. My family came from Nicaragua. They came here after the Civil War and came to this country. I don't think they ever thought that their son would be on this stage. So to me, that's what American leadership is about.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Sarah.
That's hard to follow.
Yeah.
I would say for us, for Walmart, with my Walmart hat on, what global leadership means is economic prosperity and security, which is pretty much, I think, what most people want for their families and their communities.
Congressman?
When I travel the world, every country wants to be like the United States, and every person wants to be in the United States. I always admire what former Governor Mike Huckabee said. I'd rather live in a country that people want to break into than one that they want to break out of. A typical Huckabee comment, but it's true. But we can't do that through appeasement or abdication of responsibility. We can get the partnership for the financial aspect of it. We can get the partnership for the military aspect of it. We can get the partnership for the diplomacy aspect of it. But that cultural high note, that shining city on a hill, is only what is the best idea in human history, which is the United States.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you for this really wonderful conversation. I appreciate it. So I'm going to wrap up real quick.
So I want to give just a couple of updates for USGLC. First, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. I really hope that, as I said in the beginning, that you're leaving this conversation with a deeper understanding and greater passion for America's global engagement. And we want you to share this information with your friends, your neighbors, your church members, anyone. When you hear people pushing back, I hope you take from what you heard today and share with them the importance of development and diplomacy in America's global leadership, because it is part of our national security, our economic security, and really who we are as Americans. Lastly, I want to share with you all, every year, USGLC puts together what's called a Global Impact Forum. We meet with members of Congress on the second day, but the first day is a day full of dynamic, really, really impressive speakers. This past year we had, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget everybody. We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman Brown. We had National Security Advisor. We had Chad Wolf from the Trump administration. It really is just this impressive list of speakers. And then we go and share that information with their members of Congress on Capitol Hill. So we hope you're able to join us. Mark it on your calendar. I know everybody's got your phone. It's June 9th and June 10th. Lastly, if you know of any younger folks that might be interested in our Next Gen program that I mentioned, every year we do a program that goes a year long for younger individuals to have an opportunity to learn more about these issues. And so we will start our new class in 2025. And in order to be a part of the Next Gen program, you have to have someone recommend you to come in. So as you all leave here, if you know of anybody, please let me know. Final thank yous, I want to say again, thank you to our panelists. Again, thank you to you all. It is not lost on me that Arkansas kicks off tomorrow and for the football game. So you all could be up there tailgating and that you are here, and we're very, very appreciative of it. Final thank yous. I want to say thank you to my colleagues who help do these events all across the country. And so they're just great people to work with. So thank you to each of you and to your staff who have been amazing to work with, both for this event and issues throughout the year. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
For sure.